You know, sometimes when you hear an idea that's so profound that it really does deepen your understanding and clarify your perception on the world, on events, on time scales, on why things are as they are. I try and stay open-minded all the time because I like to think that I'm always open to new ways of looking at the world, to challenging my own beliefs. And I'm always looking to, as I say, to clarify my perception, to widen my perception, to bring in more influences, to ensure that my worldview never goes stale. So the idea that I heard, I was listening to a podcast, and it was Brendan O'Neill, who is the editor of Spiked, which I recommend to, you know, anybody of a libertarian mindset, because obviously, you know, we're living in a world where, what, you're a libertarian? What? Anyway, Spiked is good. Brendan O'Neill's a very important figure at the moment, and he was talking to Melanie Phillips, the journalist Melanie Phillips, who's written for a number of newspapers, and it was a podcast. I've got a bit of hay fever today. Ugh. It was a podcast, and they were discussing, the central theme of the podcast was what can explain the West's demise. And, you know, Melanie Phillips was coming at it from the angle of that the West was in the middle of a cultural meltdown. She was making the argument that in the US there is a culture war, you know, there is some semblance of opposition to the identitarian zealots, you know, represented by Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, the trans lobby and all the rest of it. You know, the groups that are intent on dividing based on victim and oppressor, or illusions of victor and oppressor. And she was making that comparison between the US and the UK, and she was saying that in the UK that the people have just rolled over to the woke zealots and capitulated, and that that's the reason why there is virtually no opposition, certainly no real representation at all in the media of the type of person which is the majority who, you know, treasures concepts such as individuality, family, tradition, patriotism, etc., law and order. But so I found that interesting. That was the first idea, really, was that, yeah, I agree. I think that there is some opposition in the US, little to none in the UK. But her central, the one big idea that really struck me was she was talking about the West's general malaise, and she said, could the Holocaust explain why the West is in the position it's in now? And the way that she added context to her argument was to suggest that, well, the Holocaust happened, as she described, in a country that was at the epicenter of political, economic and cultural liberalism, which Germany was. Obviously not at the time of the Holocaust and in the years preceding, when, you know, when Hitler was consolidating his power. But in the time immediately before that, when Hitler and the Nazis were plotting behind the scenes, well, Germany was indeed a cultural hotbed, you know, a country of opportunity, of high culture, a place where business could be done, a very high functioning society. And yet, within the space of 10 years, those very same people who were propagating this very successful society were complicit in one way or another, the majority of them, with one of the worst crimes against humanity. The Holocaust has often been called the worst crime against humanity, which I do disagree with, actually. I think it's clearly horrific in its scale. but there have been other crimes committed in Soviet Union, China, for example, that were on even a larger scale. However, quite clearly, the Holocaust was a horrendous episode in the history of humanity. Not just for what was done, but the scale of what was done. 6 million people exterminated. And Melanie Phillips was saying, what could explain the West's lack of clarity on where it's going, lack of awareness about what it is, the absence of a universal and unifying truth, the doubt that's underpinning whether the system that we have in the West is in fact conducive to the best type of society. Because if you can go from a free and liberal society to one that willingly exterminates people on a mass scale in a very short period of time, 10 to 15 years, does that indeed tell us that our systems of governance, our cultural outlook, the way that we view ourselves in the West, does that tell us that we really are on shaky ground? That we shouldn't have too much confidence in ourselves because look what can happen? That we haven't indeed got the best form of society in terms of freedoms and democratic opportunity and participation, etc. Does the Holocaust tell us that no matter how well we think we're doing, that's what can happen very, very quickly? That's how things can unravel. So we may be able to look to the Soviet Union and China and criticise and be shocked and horrified at what happened under Stalin and Mao, and also criticise their systems of their political structures and their political ideologies, and rightly so, of course, we should. But what if ours isn't much better? Has liberal capitalism ultimately failed? What else could explain the divisions that are so rife now? What could explain the mutual suspicion? What could explain the lack of trust and the lack of confidence? Could it be, as she argued, a deep-seated psychological inability to be able to deal with the fact that the Holocaust not only was allowed to happen, not only did happen, but happened with a ruthless abandon by so many people who were part, allegedly, of this high-functioning society that we think we've had in the West for a number of years, a number of decades. So, if you can't come to terms as a society with your own lack of real moral foundational structure, if you can't come to terms with the fact that if things start to become a little unstable, there's no real consolidating force, like some kind of like contingency to ensure society doesn't degenerate in the way that the German society did, maybe we shouldn't be so confident in ourselves after all. It's a really interesting viewpoint, one I'd never considered. I'd always really thought that the West, because it wasn't just Germany's problem, that could have happened with a similar set of circumstances in any country. What happened in Germany, it was the West's problem. The West must come to terms with what happened there, and maybe it hasn't, and maybe that's a huge problem. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think when we can add in another huge factor, I think, in the West's demise, and I think it's hard to argue that there hasn't been a demise, is complacency has played a huge part. It's almost as if the decades gone by, that the good times, and they were in comparison to what we have now, were an illusion. Illusion built on, as I've said before, complacency, convenience and comfort. People have had it very easy, and complacency in particular, because under the distracted and complacent eyes of the West, China, I would argue, since the death of Mao in the late 70s, China's economic growth has been exponential, has been spectacular. I would argue certainly that it's got its influences in the West in terms of the infrastructure and the narrative as well. And then that leads us to the question, well, what if, looking at it from a different point of view, and this is not one that I'm arguing, what if the Chinese have come up with a system that, whilst may not be provide its citizens with anywhere near the level of democratic freedoms, what if is it a communist government but a non-communist society? Are the Chinese looking at the West and thinking to themselves, we have actually created a system that serves humanity better? Now, this is not what I'm arguing whatsoever. What I'm trying to do is to compare what we think about our society and our free, liberal, capitalist kind of world, with many freedoms abounding for all until, of course, March 2020, compared to what the Chinese, how their country and their organisational structures and their political ideology and worldview has played out with regard to the success of their model. Are they looking at the West, thinking that the West has spectacularly and ultimately failed, and that indeed they have a better system? I don't know. And I really need to think these ideas through more. But I find it very fascinating to consider. I talk about the word complacency. I myself was complacent. It's really in the last couple of years that I've thought about the Western style of democracy. Is it really a democracy? The Western way of Western culture, freedoms, how we shape and set up and interact within our societies. I'd always, without really properly thinking about it, assumed that was the best type of system ever invented by humanity, that best serves the citizens of any particular country. Yeah, but what if it wasn't, though? Because if this has been allowed to happen in the West, what we are now dealing with, that says to me that it's failed. And then you look across at what's happening in China, you think, well, who's won? Who's won that battle between, I don't know what to call it, systems of governance? I don't know. Ideology, political ideology, I don't know. I don't like, as you know, ideology at all. So whilst this is not, certainly far from it, a case for supporting and acknowledging the possible successes of the Chinese, it's not. I'm trying to understand what the inherent weaknesses within the Western structures are that have been exploited by very dark forces, and whether we did become too confident in what the West actually was without ever really understanding it, what it stood for. Anyway, let me know what you think of this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will speak to you all soon. Bye bye.